Was Lexington and Concord just another battle, or something more? What caused ordinary men to stand their ground against a huge empire? What would you have done on that day, April 19th, 1775? Good evening, I'm Dave Vance, and welcome to the Tennessee Informer. Thank you all for being with us tonight. It was 251 years ago yesterday that the Battle of Lexington Concord took place in 1775. These battles were the result of the British Army stationed in nearby Boston attempting to take guns, cannons, powder, and ammunition being hidden by local militia. The initial battle in Lexington occurred around 5 a.m. when the lead elements of the British Army, totaling approximately 700, engaged a group of 70-plus militia under the leadership of John Parker, a veteran of the French and Indian War. No one knows who fired the first shot heard around the world, but this was the first battle for the War of Independence. 8 of the militia were killed and 10 wounded. 1 British soldier was slightly wounded at Lexington. The militia dispersed and the British moved on towards Concord. When they arrived, they did find some of the munitions and destroyed them, but they were soon met by over 400 militia and were repulsed at the Concord Bridge. From there, all the way back to Boston, militia and Minutemen fired into the columns of British troops. At the end of the day, there were nearly 400 British casualties, and the colonists had considerably fewer. Why were British troops there in the first place? Well, it was in response to the protest for the first Stamp Act and Townshend Acts, and later the Boston Tea Party. The colony of Massachusetts was being punished by the Crown. The British demanded the culprits in and around Boston pay for the lost tea. They refused. As a result, the port of Boston was shut down, the legislature was dissolved, and the king appointed a royal governor. Additionally, all trials were to be held in England rather than citizens being judged by their peers. Local militias began running drills and local communities worked out communication signals. They were ready when the British arrived. These men and others throughout the colonies believed they were fighting for their rights as British citizens according to the law. They believed they were in the right and that it was important enough to go up against the most powerful army in the world. While the war is often referred to as the American Revolution, the revolution happened in the minds of the colonists well before the shooting ever started. The Enlightenment, as it's often called, is credited with providing the ideas behind the revolution, and that may be partially true. But as I said, they believed themselves to be fighting for God-given rights already recognized in British law to a great degree. But there is another element overlooked in recent decades, and the influence of this group cannot be ignored. In fact, the British government identified this very influential group as being the chief culprit for colonial defiance. They labeled this group the Black Robed Regiment. And who actually were the Black Robed Regiment? Our guest, Richard May, host of the Dangerous Christian radio show and a former street pastor, is here tonight to give us a history lesson on this very influential group. Richard will be joining us here in just a few minutes. But first, a word from our sponsor, LifeWave. This amazing product uses light reflection to activate the body's own natural energy, supporting healing, improving performance, and combating aging, all without drugs or stimulants. Please check them out, and we'll be right back with our guest, Richard May.
Light, the energy of life itself. Since the beginning of time, light has sustained us, fueled our growth, and shaped the world. Even Einstein recognized that everything we are is made of light. But what if we could harness the light within us, not just to live, but to renew, restore, and rejuvenate? Introducing LifeWave X39, the first product in the world that activates stem cells using our body's own light. Backed by clinical research, multiple patents, and over 10 years of stem cell research, a revolutionary wearable light technology that unlocks the power of activating our own stem cells with a single, safe, affordable, non-transdermal patch that puts you back in control of how you look, feel, and perform. Unlike drugs or chemicals, X39 works naturally, awakening your body's ability to heal and thrive. It's time to unlock your full potential, restore your vitality, and embrace a healthier, more vibrant you.
Welcome back to the show, and now let's welcome our special guest, Richard May. Richard, thanks so much for joining us. How are you tonight?
Ready to go.
Well, good. Tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got the name, or how your show got the name, The Dangerous Christian.
Well, uh, the street preacher is not exactly a popular cultural phenomenon, and yet it's the street preachers of today that are really sending out the truth in the places where it doesn't want to be. It's one thing to be a preacher in a church. It's another thing to be a preacher in downtown San Francisco on a street corner.
Wow.
And so part of that danger came from being in danger rather than being a dangerous person. And so I started a radio show here a while back, and I thought, well, that's probably the best way to describe it, because my passion is to equip people to be more effective Christians. And if you're an effective Christian, you really are a dangerous Christian to the enemy.
Makes sense. And so you started out in San Francisco?
Well, that's just the first place that came to memory when I'm thinking about a dangerous place to have preached. I started out in San Diego and started a couple of churches and pastored those, and street preaching was my calling at the time from the Lord, and so I had young men that I would train in street preaching, and we would go around to different parts of the state and sometimes across the nation. And then the Lord called me out here to Tennessee, and I started a Bible study in the West Hills of Knoxville, and it's grown to quite a large group of men. And then a couple of years ago, I was looking for a church, and the Lord led me to this church, and lo and behold, here was a man that I had interviewed a couple of years before that for his resolution to have a month of prayer here in Tennessee. And we ended up going to the same church unbeknownst to me.
And that was Monty Fritz.
That's correct. So we've become very close friends, and he asked me to be kind of the spiritual lead on his campaign.
Yeah, and you keep an eye out for him too, right?
Yes, but that's something we don't let him know about. I'm
Okay.
kind of like that. I'm kind of like that dog laying in the shade up on the hill, and he's actually keeping an eye on the flock for the wolves.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
So
good. Now you have that radio show that's on 1470?
correct. Dangerous Christian is on Monday afternoons from 2 to 3, and then from 5 to 6, we've got the Fuel for Your Soul that I co-host with a man named Tim Cox, who's also been a friend for a long time.
Okay. And so you've been in Tennessee about 10 years now?
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, not even naturalized Tennessean yet. I'm still an import.
Okay. Still a refugee.
Yes.
All right. But a good refugee. A welcomed refugee as opposed to a lot of them.
Yeah, I literally saw California circle the drain from my dad was a personal friend of Ronald Reagan, and we've been involved in conservative politics since the 1960s. In fact, my dad started one of the first John Birch Society chapters in California a year or two after it was formed.
Wow. Solid
So,
background.
yeah, we've got quite a. I've often joked that my mom would make Ann Coulter look like a liberal.
Hey, so before we get to talking about the Black Robed Regiment, let's talk a little bit about the War for Independence and specifically the battles of Lexington and Concord, because, I think those should be more recognized than they are. April 19th, that was yesterday, the 251st anniversary, but I mean, that is, it started the war. Or it was the first battle of the war, and I think it should probably be remembered more than it is, and we should probably study more than it is. But this was like one of the first acts of attempted gun control, which, hey, we no longer have the British government, but we still have a lot of people that think they're king and would like to take our rights.
Two of the things that really stand out to me are that the British troops came to churches to take guns and gunpowder away from them. and that they came to homes to literally abduct and imprison, in one sense, a church leader. If you could imagine, you've been going to church for a lifetime, like one of the Baptist churches out here in the hollers,
Right.
and the federal government or whoever's in power comes out to take your senior elder or your pastor, and that the idea that the threat that they see is from the church. This wasn't so much a revolution as it was a battle for freedom and liberty.
Right.
And it's the settings were more important, I think, than the mere act of coming down and from England and putting down some protesters that were tired about the taxes. They were literally targeting the cultural conservatives of the time.
And you know, and the people, the colonists that were standing up, I mean, they considered themselves loyal British citizens. At this point, still most of them did.
Yep.
And this was not the first time that the citizens of Britain, whether, you know, maybe the first time on this side of the ocean, but these type of things had happened in the past in Britain, and they had stood up. And so this was not per se revolutionary. They were just doing what their fathers or grandfathers had done in the past, having to stand up to the king or having to stand up to Parliament, whatever the case might be in the past. So it was kind of a tradition, and they believed their rights came from God even then, and they were standing up for that.
That's why I really am reluctant to use the word revolution. We do not have Revolution Day. We have Independence Day.
Yes.
And
yes.
I think the people that passed that appreciated the distinction between those words.
I agree. And if you read it, and of course, this is the 250th anniversary of this July 4th, will be really July 2nd, but I'm sure you know the story behind the 2nd and the 4th, and we'll cover that in a later show. But, you know, I see it more as a divorce decree than a birth certificate. I know a lot of people see it as a birth certificate, but it's much more a divorce decree, because especially when you get to the end of it, it says that these colonies ought to be free and independent states. And that gets lost a lot.
Yeah, probably the leading expert on all this is obviously David Barton and his son Tim. They rattle off dates and names and places just as if they were a recording of history or that they lived through it. I'm more of a big picture kind of guy, and focusing on the fact that while the Declaration of Independence and the grievances against King George, there was a number of them. It depends on how you count them, either 17 or 26, because one had a contained list within it. But there wasn't a single religious grievance in there. Every single one of those was civil in nature, which that alone paints an entirely different picture than most people have been led to believe, that they think it was some kind of a bunch of religious fanatics revolting against the king. No, they were entirely civil injustices. Every single one of them had nothing to do with religion. And yet, when it came to the British response to this resistance, they targeted the Christian leaders. And that dissonance, to me, is a key element of how we looked at it as opposed to how Britain looked at it. And which brings us up to the whole idea of why they called it I mean, there were literally discussions between the spies for the British and the agents for the British and the king, asking who's leading this. And it was universally accepted that it was the Black Robed Regiment.
Yeah.
The Protestant clergy, if you will, whether it was the Congregationalists or the Presbyterians or the Methodists, all three of those played a significant role in our battle for independence. But it was weird because we were looking at civil injustices and they were thinking that it was a religious revolt. The British were.
That's strange. I wonder why they thought that. But, before we get really into that, I do want to spend just a little more time on that day. I mean, imagine you got 70, and I said this in the intro, and I've read different sites about different numbers. So I see different numbers on the casualties, different numbers on how many British troops and how many American militia. But these were professional British troops.
Yes.
And these were American militia / Minutemen. And they're at Lexington. The first group at Lexington, there was like 70 some of them, 70, 77, whatever, led by John Parker. And there was a column. I know that I saw one thing that said 700, and I don't know. I don't think there was all 700 in that lead column, but they certainly had the advantage. And they were standing up against the most powerful army in the world. They knew that the odds were not in their favor. And I remember one of the things I've read and this was throughout the Revolution, the militia were terrified of bayonet charges. And the British were very disciplined, and they would initiate. As a matter of fact, it talked about, one of the things I read recently, it talked about that there was actually a bayonet charge during that the British, they killed, I think, 8 of the militia and wounded 10 more. I think they had one guy slightly wounded at that first skirmish. And so those guys, they dispersed. And we don't know yet. We still don't know who fired first. That's one of those things. We don't know if it was the British firing first or the militia, an accidental discharge. I don't know. But those guys were, we got to have our hats off to them that they were even willing to go out there and stand up to the British Army, which was the best army in the world at the time.
Well, this is strictly between you and I. We don't want this to go out onto the airwaves. So I'm just joking. But I'm going to confess something that I don't talk about very much. And I was the chaplain, the battalion leading chaplain for a very large state militia.
Okay.
So I have personal experience with the state of mind of private civilians who have trained to defend themselves and their cities. And believe me, we had 76-year-old men that had never done anything but hunt a squirrel to hardened combat veterans and everything in between. And the one thing that was uniting them is this belief that God created us all equal, if you will, in the sense of a divine right of self-expression and liberty, and that was what they were fighting for. And there is an old saying, Dave, that it is a much more effective army that is fighting for something than against something.
Yep, absolutely, absolutely.
And that's what we were doing. We were the ones fighting for something that we felt very strongly about. And the actual numbers of a militia, even when I was involved, was a very closely guarded secret. So they could have reported 400, but in reality, from my readings of some of the history reports, those numbers would surge by 3 or 4-fold as the enemy was engaged.
Yes, absolutely. And because after they pretty much, that was pretty much a walkover at that point, and they headed on to Concord. And then they did find some of the munitions, but they're like, we know there's more than this. And that gave more of the militia a chance, and that's where they had their first, I guess, real engagement where they were received any fire back would have been at the bridge there in Concord.
Yeah, correct.
But they quickly realized, hey, and I've seen different numbers, but there were actually, I think, thousands of militiamen overall throughout that, because this is like a 20-mile stretch, somewhere around approximately 20 miles from Boston to Concord. And so Lexington was just the first stop along the way. And they met a little resistance there, obviously not much. They kept going. Concord was the first battle. Then they realized, hey, we need to be pulling out of here. This is not looking good. And
no, because the numbers were growing on the militia side every minute.
Absolutely. And I remember, too, reading that during this whole time, because the British had been occupying Boston for a while, And so the local towns, they started training. They had a lot of each town had its own militia, and they were all in the loop on signaling. Because remember, I mean, we hear about the story about Paul Revere. Obviously, Paul Revere and James Prescott and William Dawes and a few others, I believe, were they actually had done that their midnight ride, so called, the night prior. But they went to all these little different towns, and all these different towns had militias. So these guys were trained, they were ready, and they all showed up. And from Concord back to Boston, that's where the British, they took a licking and kept heading back to Boston.
Oh, what's that old song? The British kept a coming, and we
Yeah, that's Battle of New Orleans, but yeah.
Battle of New Orleans. Yeah.
So,
But it was the same kind of scenario where, as the battle developed, more and more men on our side of the militia, it just swelled the ranks to the point where it was just an overwhelming number.
Yeah. And by the time they got back to Lexington, that first group that they had engaged and that had taken off, they were back there to get a little bit of revenge.
Yep.
Parker's Revenge, they call it. But, it'd be I'd like to go out there sometime and see all that, even though it's in Massachusetts. It's something I'd like to see. I've always liked studying about the, early American history. So any other thoughts on the battle or that time frame before we get into the Black Robed Regiment?
Well, just that as an intro, kind of a foundation to all that is that in those days, there was no media. There were no newspapers or very small ones. Ben Franklin was doing a little bit, but they had a few little handwritten things that were going around of late, events. But ultimately, what the listeners of this show should be realizing is that the hub of the community where everything was found out about and talked about was the church.
Yep.
It was literally the central hub. And that's one of the things that is my dream here in Tennessee, is to get the church more involved with the community again, rather than just the place to show up on Easter.
Yeah, that was the center of everything at that time.
Yes.
And that's where you found out about everything. And you know what? The pastors were not afraid to talk about what would be, now they would call that preaching politics, or talking about politics in the pulpit, and you can't do that. They weren't afraid to talk about what was right and wrong, no matter who was doing it.
No, it was their obligation to provide a moral compass, both in culture and politics. They talk about the dangers of premarital sex and drinking and swearing and everything that has to do with culture. And then they would also say that this guy is a swindler and we would never trust him in politics. I mean, they would lay it out. In fact, that's one of the tenets of the modern day Black Robed Regiment, is that they do not take 501c3 status, and that they do commit to making election sermons.
Okay, so talk about that group just a little bit, then we'll get into the historical group.
Okay. Well, there is a current Black Robed Regiment organization that is not not starting another battle of independence, but I guess in a sense it is. It's a battle of independence for the churches to get out of the control of the government. And so it's called America's Black Robed Regiment. It was founded 20, 30 years ago by a friend of mine, Reverend Bill Cook. And we are slowly going across the nation, taking dedications from churches who will commit to the concept of addressing politics and culture, giving election sermons, and to disconnect from a 501c3 status with the federal government.
Good. Do they have like 501c3 burnings or something?
Well, it's not necessarily a burning, but it is a you're pulling the release cord.
Right. So tell us about the Black Robed Regiment at that time.
Well, back in the day, I mean, there's obvious key figures and stuff, and there's I thought long about this, Dave, about how what I wanted to talk about, because so many people have done such a great job on this. Tim Barton and David Barton, his dad, have written books. They've given, there's YouTube lectures on it. If someone really wanted to get into the names and stuff, but there are a couple of very important figures. Jonas Clark, obviously, in Lexington. I believe it was literally on his front door where the first confrontation occurred. He gave an incredible sermon a year later to celebrate the first anniversary of it. And that would be a sermon that people could find. It's easily downloadable. The anniversary of the War of Independence. Then, of course, with the dictates of the king, I said King King George, but I think it was actually King Charles. The
George at the time. It was George.
I think it was George. Yeah,
it was George. King George III during the Revolution. Or during the,
one of the things that was really being struck down at home in England was that you were allowed free speech up until it came to the royals, and you never, I mean, you could be hauled away to prison for saying that, you know, the Queen's hat looked like a Easter bunny or something. And so the idea that the focus of our grievances were against the king was shocking to the sensitivities of the English citizen of the time, that you would dare speak out against the king. And that was an interesting cultural aspect that doesn't get talked about too much, but that he was being unfair was just unheard of. That the kings, there was a concept back in those days called noblesse oblige, which meant that it was the obligation of the noble living elite parties to take care of the lower caste citizens.
oh, why, thank you.
Noblesse oblige. It was the obligation of the noble people to care. So there was literally a vast class distinction that we farmers and craftsmen and stuff would never dare speak out in a bad way against the upper class. And we find that sensitivity today among the ruling elite, where they dare not, you know, hear any criticism against them.
Yeah, they still think that. The ones who are, a lot of them that are elected in office, they still think that.
Yep. So it was an interesting kind of schism of cultures, because we had a lot of people at this point that are second or third generation American. A lot of them came over in the middle 1600s and were now, in fact, even some of the pastors were the sons of pastors in these little colony churches. So there was that element that had tasted liberty and freedom. But then there was also a very large contingent of people that were loyal British citizens in America at that time. And some of the estimates range anywhere from only 17 to 23% were behind the movement for independence. And it was an interesting realization that for the most part, they were either loyal to Britain or they were saying, don't upset the apple cart. Let's just leave things alone.
Right.
And I think whether you're on the side of a conservative liberty belief, or you're on the Marxist side or the Islamist side, it's interesting that down through history, it seems like there is a critical number of supporters at about 20% for a movement to get traction.
Yeah, that sounds about right. I mean, I've heard different numbers about who's, you know, I've heard, about a third supported it, a third opposed it, and a third didn't care. They just wanted to be left alone. I don't know. I don't know if there's ever been a real comprehensive study done on that, as far as supporters and who supported, who opposed, and who just didn't care, or who was going to try to make money off of it, no matter who was in charge.
Yeah, exactly. It was not an overwhelming majority as it has been portrayed in some history books.
Okay.
So we have that, and then we also have the idea that the firebrands, the people that were literally stoking the fire of independence, were doing it based on God's word. And so this is another thing that's overlooked, is that it was literally from the pulpits. This is one thing that the British got right. It was the pulpit that was saying that it is the obligation of a Christian to push back against tyranny. And a lot of that came from the fact that the theology of that time was very different than it is today in this post-Christian nation. But they believed that there were actually three groups of human beings from a spiritual sense. There were the sinners, there were the saints. Okay, so we've got the people that have accepted Jesus as their Lord and Savior, and then we've got the people that didn't. But the founding fathers actually believed that there was a third category according to the Bible, and that was the wicked. These were declared enemies of God and oppressors of people. One of the hallmark descriptions in the Bible, I've done a whole study on this that I've written out as like an 8-page Bible study. The sinner, the saint, and the wicked. And the Bible defines the wicked with about 7 hallmarks, and about 4 of them have to do with oppressing other people.
Wow. Today we call those the elected, right?
Yeah, right. But that's what they believed they were fighting against, was wickedness.
Wickedness in high places.
Yes.
Okay.
And so there was this concept of, this is a just event, that we are obligated by God to resist tyranny.
What biblical references did they use for that?
All of the exhortations to deliver the oppressed. There's multiple of them in the Bible.
Okay.
That you were to deliver the orphan, the widow, and the oppressed. And the funny thing is about the word orphan in the original Hebrew is that it meant fatherless, not parentless, just fatherless.
Ah, okay. Who were some of the other prominent members? You mentioned Jonas Clark, but who did they consider the ringleaders of the regiment?
Oh, I would say that it comes down to probably John Winthrop was another really big one. He was a Puritan leader that was the first governor of Massachusetts when it was a Bay colony. And let me see, who else would I come to mind? Mayhew, the Reverend Jonathan Mayhew. He was a Congregationalist minister in Boston, and of course, John Adams John Adams was one of the guys that was I think it was Jonas Clark's home when the British first showed up, and was warned by who's the guy that rode in on the horse?
Revere.
Paul Revere.
Yeah.
Paul Revere came up and said, "Hey, the British are coming to take
you and John Hancock and somebody else. I can't remember now."
Yeah, and I think it was John Adams. And the funny thing is that even though there was only, I think, 1 or 2 pastors that were signatories to the Declaration, every single one of those men were incredibly strong followers of Christ. In fact, in a private letter between Thomas Jefferson and another man that was a friend of his in another city, and I've got the quote somewhere, but he literally said, Thomas Jefferson said, "I am a true believer and disciple of Jesus Christ," in his own words. And Thomas Jefferson is accused of being nothing more than a deist.
Right, yeah.
And yet, and one of the funny stories about the whole thing about how he tore out pages of the Bible, he didn't do it to tear out pages. He tore out passages to carry with him to inspire him.
Okay, I'd never heard that. I knew that he rewrote a Bible and he wrote it for the Indians, and that he left out a lot of the things, making references to miracles and other supernatural phenomena. But the reason, what I read was the reason that he did that was because the Indians needed to get the central message, not just focus on the supernatural per se.
Yeah, I mean, he actually authored some of the original, what we call paraphrased gospel tracts that would be handed out, and that
Right,
I've used even to this day,
right,
where it says, someday you will, everyone will face God, and then a summary of why we say that.
right. Now, you mentioned Adams, but Adams wasn't a pastor.
No, 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 he wasn't a pastor, but I mean, they were all dedicated church-going Christians.
Right. Were there other prominent members of the Black Robed Regiment that were not from Massachusetts? I'm sure the other colonies had to have some.
Let me see if I can find any here in my notes. Reverend Robert Hunt, I think he was up in Virginia. And let's see, there was a couple of brothers, and I can't remember their name. It's a very long German name. But
Muhlenberg.
one of them was, huh?
Muhlenberg. Muhlenberg.
Muhlenberg.
Yep.
Yes, the Muhlenberg brothers. And
Yep.
one was a strong advocate for the independent movement, and the other one lived in New York and was telling his brother that it was all folly until the British came in and burned down his church and took occupied New York, and then he took off with his family and joined the resistance, if you will.
Yeah.
So it's a fascinating story. Most history books are very dry about it. I can certainly suggest that there are better ways to learn it, and I think if you just would listen to some of the YouTube productions that David Barton and his son Tim have put on, they're just remarkable. But one of my favorites is actually by William Federer, and William
He's
Federer
good.
authored,
He's really good.
the American Minute.
Yep. Yep.
But he actually wrote a book called Miracles in American History.
I'm
I
not
don't know if
familiar
you've
with the
heard.
book, but I'm familiar with him. We actually had him on a show about a year ago. He's that guy's got he's a wealth of knowledge on multiple topics.
Yeah, it's hard to get him to stop.
Yeah, that's true.
I've
That's
had him
true.
on my show too a number of times. But this little book called Miracles in American History, more than anything else, actually chronicles the providential intervention of God in so many unexplainably supernatural events, from a fog lifting for
To cross
you
over
know
in New York, yes, to save
yep,
the army. Yep. 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 Yep.
the time when George, in fact, the miracle that is my favorite is when George Washington, in his early command, had lost battle after battle against the British, and his people were just about done in. And he went out into the forest of Valley Forge to pray, and was overheard by a village man that was walking through the forest. And he stopped and listened to the entire prayer, ran back to the village, told everybody about George Washington's passionate intercessory prayer for God to help them. And that changed the entire village's attitude from this poor ragtag group of people, trying to get free food from them, to them rushing out and just serving them everything, giving them everything they had. And from that point forward, George Washington never lost a battle. And
Wow.
that portrait is one of the most famous ones in Washington D.C.
Yeah, I know
of
the
him
one you're
kneeling.
talking about. Yeah. What year was that? What year in the war was that?
It was very early in the war.
And he never lost another battle because I thought he lost most of them until Yorktown. To be honest with you.
Well, I don't know when the prayer took place, but from my reading of what happened is that from that point forward, he had victory after victory. So I don't know if it was 100% or if it was just a dramatic change, but that is actually the meme that I use behind me when I have my Dangerous Christian show, is the portrait of him praying in the forest at Valley Forge.
Yeah. Now, so this time frame, wasn't this still in the when a lot of people believed in the era of the divine right of kings, at least to some degree?
Oh, absolutely. Again, that goes back to that concept of noblesse oblige, where they were obligated by God because they had been appointed by God. And so this divine right of leadership was something that they thought came from God because of passages in the Bible where it says, I raise up kings and I knock down kings, or kingdoms and kings. And so they literally thought that but the problem is they didn't read in Hosea, where God accuses Israel of appointing kings themselves that he did not choose.
Ah, okay. Yeah, they overlooked that part.
They overlooked that part. I'm telling you, you got to read those minor prophets. A lot of good stuff in there. So yeah, there is a sense of a divineness to it, but it's funny because this is a raw point with me, Dave, and I'll be driving down the freeway and I'll see this huge billboard that says God is in control. But in reality, the entire Bible is about him trying to fix the things that men have done against his will.
Yeah, there's a lot of that. Yeah, I would agree.
There is a lot of that. And so while God is ultimately in control of the outcome, it's kind of like he's the cruise ship and we're doing all kinds of bad stuff to the cruise ship while it's still heading towards its destination.
Right, getting off course en route. So, what are some of the other examples of the impact of the Black Robed Regiment that you can think of during the war?
Well, I think the greatest impact was that they believed that there was a God-given right for liberty, and that there is something that we've lost, and that is the power of believing in a just war.
Well, maybe because we haven't had one in a long time. I don't know.
You think? But they honestly believed that they were in a just war, and that all goes back to their leaders were spiritual leaders. Their leaders were moral leaders. Their leaders were political leaders, but they were all pastors. And we have disconnected the church from 2/3 of that formula today, that the pastor is supposed to stay away from culture and politics. And it's funny because one of our more recent contemporary journalists, Andrew Breitbart, who's no longer with us, once said that politics is downstream from culture. Do you remember that saying?
Yeah.
But what I added to that immediately after that is when I remember it being on my radio show and I heard that, and I said, yes, but the church should be upstream from both.
Yeah, well, it has to be. If it's not going to be effective.
It's not going to be relevant or effective, and that's why. On the one hand, that my whole 20 or 33 years of ministry has been trying to get the church involved more in culture and politics, and I can say for an absolute certainty that in my first political campaign I was involved in was in 1964 when Barry Goldwater ran for president. And so I've been involved in politics for 60 years? 60 years. Good Lord, has it been that long?
62, going on 62.
So I can say with some credibility that this campaign that Monty Fritz is running is the most unique I've ever seen, because it is engaging culture and politics again with Christianity. And we are getting churches openly endorsing him.
Good.
Which I have never seen before.
No, most of them are afraid that if they do anything or say anything, they're going to lose their 501c3, even though I don't think there's a record of any church ever losing their 501c3. That threat has been around for years, and I think some pastors use it as an excuse, just because they don't want to make people mad that the few that tithe. I think they don't want to make them mad, and so that's what they're afraid of.
Yeah, there have been a number of churches that have openly defied it and have been threatened with letters, but there's never been any, because they knew it would go right to the Supreme Court.
Right.
And now, if it was ever studied, I mean, goodness sakes, what is it our Constitution says that the Congress shall have, pass no law to infringe, expression of religion and free speech, and my goodness, I mean, that's all that Johnson Amendment ever did.
Oh yeah. But I mean, that's one of those things that they have definitely perverted over the years. Not just Johnson's creation of that, but in general, I think that the government has perverted that beyond, well beyond recognition.
So we have the original Black Robe Regiment being the source of both moral inspiration and practical application of resisting tyranny, because it was there was one pastor that literally was asked, I think it was Jonas Clark, will your men fight? And he answered, this is what we have been training for. So we know with historical records that they were literally practicing firearms training
Prior to that, yeah.
on the church grounds.
Which pastor was it? And I don't remember. Would have been fairly early on in the war. That during the sermon or during the church meeting, I'm not sure if it was actually a Sunday service or what it was, but at some point in time, he took off his cleric robe and he had on a uniform and a sword, and he was ready to go, and he encouraged others. Do you remember? Was that one of the Muhlenbergs?
I actually think that was Jonas Clark, but I'm not sure.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, I mean, he was walking around giving the sermon, and literally took off his black robe, and he had on the colonial military
Uniform,
garb of
yeah.
an officer underneath it. And he says, are you ready to fight? So, I mean, there was a lot of dramatic stuff that happened there. Some of the primary miracles that got us started. And that was another thing, that we believed that there was divine providence for the formation of this country. And the uniqueness of the way this country was formed stands out in all of history. Even Israel was formed by God, whereas we were formed for God. We chose to be formed, whereas God chose to form Israel.
I never heard it that way, but yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, and
to that point, all the colonies were very religious. I mean, they were Christian colonies. We hear about freedom of religion, but it was all different Christian denominations. Now, and
Yes.
not all the colonies were the same. The colonies varied. You might have Congregationalists in this one, Anglican in this one, Methodist in this one. I think the Baptists actually came later.
Yes.
But it was a mix. And then I think there was, a small contingent of Catholics.
Yep, there was, and there were, the Puritans and a couple of denominations that no longer exist. And in fact, that was the cause of the whole response about there being a separation between church and state, is because they were worried that the newly formed federal government would recognize one denomination
Yep.
as the official denomination.
Yeah. They were trying to
so-
avoid what they had seen in England, what they'd seen throughout Europe.
Yes.
A Catholic king or queen takes power and they kill all the Protestants. A Protestant king or queen takes power, they kill all the Catholics. Or they take their rights, hey, you can't carry guns, whatever. All those kind of things. Those things are not new, and they weren't new at that time either.
And it wasn't even just Europe. Look at the Russian Orthodox Church and how it was used in the 17 and 1800s to control the people. I mean, there were abuses across the world from religion.
Yeah. Well,
And so that was what they were trying not to do, that our newly formed government would not have an official religion.
and we're lucky ours was not a revolution against religion, against Christianity, but the French Revolution very much was, to a great degree.
Yeah. And that's every time I hear people compare the two and say there was this similarity and that similarity, there was hardly anything about those two revolutions. Or theirs was a revolution, ours was a battle for independence.
Yes.
And that, to me, draws the distinction right there.
A revolution and a divorce, two different things.
Totally.
Any closing thoughts?
No, I just am so blessed that we've had this chance to talk, and I'm sorry that I don't have all the stats and numbers and names and things, but I'm more of a big picture guy, and also that I wanted it more of a connection to the fact that this was a just war by a bunch of people, like you said in your intro, that had absolutely no hope of winning except that they believed that God had told them to do this.
Yeah. Well, hey, I think you provided some good information, and you've definitely got a different perspective. You've been involved with militias, so that's not a perspective that most people have.
Very quick, just 10 seconds. My first sermon in front of this militia, there's maybe 400 armed men standing in front of me, and I'm about to give a sermon. And I told them that this is the first time I've been scared about what I was going to talk about.
And some people out there might be listening, oh, militia, that's crazy. But you know what? Militias are what the founders, and if you read the Constitution, the founders were against the standing army. Cut and dried, they were against the standing army. Why were they against the standing army? Well, because of what they had experienced. And so they were very leery of a standing army. They wanted every state to have a militia because, yes, we had the Continental Army, and even though a lot of the militias were not reliable at all times in all battles and all places, we couldn't have won it without the militias. I mean,
that's right.
And every state had it, and that was the goal. That's what the Constitution called for. They didn't call for a huge standing army, and we did not have huge standing armies till later on. Even at the beginning of the totally misnamed Civil War, we only had 13,000 troops in our country.
If you understood the truth of militias, you would understand the words of the Second Amendment.
Absolutely. Absolutely. They are definitely connected. They are definitely connected. Well-regulated militia. It did not say a well-regulated standing army. And if you go back and read, and you know this, but I'm saying this for the audience that may or may not know, you go back and read what they said at the convention, what they talked about in the ratification debates. They were scared to death not only of a overpowering federal, how that the government could overreach. One of the main ways they saw that is with a standing army. So they were totally against a standing army, even though we've grown up in a time when we can't remember when there wasn't a standing army. You have to go back. There's probably nobody alive today. Well, there's nobody alive today that doesn't remember having a fairly large standing army.
Absolutely.
So it's what we have allowed and what we have become was not what we were intended to be by any means.
Amen, brother.
So, and it would be good if people were more comfortable with having a well-regulated militia, which includes everybody. Doesn't mean you have to be in a militia to own a weapon. It means everybody has a weapon, but you also have a militia to protect and defend your state.
Absolutely.
And from what? From an oppressive federal government. That's what it was created for. That's
tyranny.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we got a lot to that today, and we've had that for decades, absolutely decades. Oh yeah,
Right.
and there's certainly tyrannical businesses as well, and of course you have the whole business government tyranny that goes on in a lot of cases. They work together well, unfortunately. So, anything else you want to hit?
That was it. Thank you for the opportunity. I pray for blessings over this program of yours, and I look forward to seeing you somewhere on the campaign trail.
Well, hey, thank you, and I'm sure we will. And we do have your website up there. That's Truth Radio and the Dangerous Christian. And Are they both on 1470?
Yes.
Okay, both 1470. And what are the times again?
3 o'clock Friday, 3 o'clock Monday, and 5 o'clock Monday.
Okay, great.
But it's also a video archive that you can go to and listen to anytime.
Okay, cool. Well, hey, thanks for being with us. Thanks for what you do, and I'm sure I'll see you out there on the trail somewhere. Audience, I want to let the audience know, hey, don't go anywhere because now it's time for the Informer Report. Justice Clarence Thomas recently remarked that the progressive ideology is incompatible with the Declaration of Independence and our system of government. He has recently encouraged Americans to speak up and stand up for our country, and I agree 100%. Now, I think Justice Thomas and Justice Alito are the two best on the Supreme Court, by far. It's not even close. Having said that, I find it ironic that he would bring up the incompatibility of the so-called progressive agenda when most of their agenda has been enacted through the courts over the years and not through Congress or through the legislature. The courts are the ones who, more than any other branch, have allowed this progressive agenda to advance. Pick a topic: abortion, marriage, just about every other hot button issue our country has faced in the last 60 years has been forced on us by the Supreme Court, and usually against the will of the majority of the American people. To make matters worse, the issues were not issues that the Constitution, as it was written by the founders, ever intended to be decided for all by the Supreme Court. They were originally state issues. On the show last week, my guest, William Watkins Jr., an author and an attorney and a member of the Independent Institute, discussed his new book, The Independent Guide to the Constitution: Original Intention, Modern Inventions. One of the main topics we discussed was how the 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause and Equal Protection Clause have all but replaced the Constitution. We also discussed how the Supreme Court created out of whole cloth the incorporation doctrine that began in 1925 when the Supreme Court for the first time claimed that the 14th Amendment, passed nearly 60 years earlier, required that the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights be applied to the states now. This turns the Bill of Rights on its head. Remember, the Bill of Rights were a limit on the federal government, not the state government. The states have their own Bill of Rights. And this is counter to the court's finding initially. So the court for 60 years said, no, it's not the Bill of Rights only apply to the federal government. Actually, it predates that. I'm saying 60 years after the 14th Amendment, up until 1925, anytime it was brought up, they shot it down and said, no, Bill of Rights is a limit on the federal government, not the state government. Since that time, most of the Bill of Rights has been incorporated against the states. As a result of this, we have not only allowed the court to grab this power, but we as a people are more divided than we ever have been. Now, in fairness, Congress could fix this through Article 3, Section 2, but they choose not to, so that the responsibility can fall on the court, a court that doesn't answer to the people. Now, to Justice Thomas's credit, he did denounce the court-created doctrine of substantive due process in the Dodd decision. This doctrine allows the court to arbitrarily create a standard for a particular case. But he has to know, he's too smart not to know, that the court-created doctrine of incorporation is one of the main avenues used by the left, and that it undercuts our Constitution and is also incompatible with the principles outlined in the Declaration of Independence, which he also referenced. Maybe somebody should send him a copy of Mr. Watkins' book or a link to the show from last week. By the way, there is a link to last week's show in the video description below. One last thing on that. Like I said, Thomas is one of the best ones we have up there. Him and Alito are really the only two that are somewhat consistent and conservative and constitutionally minded. But we can't fix this country as long as we allow a branch of the federal government to usurp that much power. I mean, that was not our design. And, sometimes we like their decisions. Hey, I like the Bruen opinion. Love the Bruen opinion. I don't like the fact that it's the federal government usurping power that was not theirs. And so if we're allowing them to be the final arbiter, that means they can change their mind down the road. States have to recognize, look, if they are going to usurp power, if they're going to attempt to take a power that they don't have, even if they're saying something we like, we're going to say, look, you don't have that power. States have to stand up. We're not going to fix this country without the states standing up. And hey, we've got some crazy states that are not likely to change. But when you have the court deciding for all, we are going to be at each other's throats, bottom line. So we're much better off to have a strict adherence to the 10th Amendment, a strict adherence to the Constitution as a whole, and let states make their own decisions on things that were intended to be state decisions. That wraps up this installment of the Informer Report. If you have a news story that you want to alert us to, be sure to send us an email at tninformer.tv@gmail.com. I want to thank the audience for taking the time to watch our program tonight. It doesn't cost anything to subscribe, so please be sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons, as well as the notification bell so you never miss an episode. We appreciate your support. Please help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. We only need 40 more. So if you haven't yet, please subscribe and share us with your friends. Check out our audio podcasts on iHeartRadio, Spotify, and other platforms as well. Sign up for our weekly newsletter at our website, teeninformer.com. Find and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Got a couple of announcements here real quick. Monty Fritz, meet and greet, Tuesday, April 28th, 6:30 p.m. at the Witherspoon Clubhouse, 1469 Witherspoon Drive in Brentwood. Please RSVP by April 23rd. Join us next Monday, April 27th, 7 p.m., when our guest will be Chris Holton. Chris is from the Center for Security Policy, and he'll be here to tell us all about a new organization that states can consult in the battle against Islamist expansion. This includes in Tennessee. It's expanding everywhere. They're expanding here in Tennessee, and we need to push back. Please take the time to check out the other shows brought to you by West Tennessee TV by going to westtennesseetv.com or myparistv.com. You can find links to the Mike Weatherford Show and Sportscast with Jeremy Buckaloo. That's it for now. Good night from Paris, Tennessee, that is.